Chapter 11. After long hours of unconsciousness, Tommy woke up with an aching head. Slowly he became aware of other things, of cold, stiff arms and legs, of hunger, of not being able to move his lips, and that his head was resting on solid stone. Yes, he was lying on hard stones, and he was in pain, unable to move, extremely hungry, cold and uncomfortable. Surely, although Mrs. Perenna's beds had never been soft, this could not be. Then he remembered. Of course, Haydock, the transmitter, the German waiter. Turning in at the gates of Sans-Souci, someone had struck him down. So Haydock hadn't been quite such a fool. Either he'd followed him, or maybe Appledore had. His eyes, accustomed to the darkness, could just see a small rectangle of pale light, a tiny window slightly open. It was cold, and the air smelt damp. He was, he thought, lying in a cellar. His hands and feet were tied, and there was a gag in his mouth, secured by a bandage. I'm really in trouble now, thought Tommy. At that moment, a door was pushed open. Appledore came in and set a candle on the ground and a tray on which was a jug of water, a glass, and some bread and cheese. He said in a quiet voice, I am about to take the gag off. You will then be able to eat and drink. If, however, you make the slightest sound, I will replace it immediately. As soon as Tommy's mouth was free, Appledore held the glass to his lips. The water did him the world of good. He murmured stiffly, That's better. I'm not quite so young as I was. Now for the food, Fritz. Or is it Franz? The man said quietly, My name here is Appledore. He held the slice of bread and cheese up, and Tommy ate it hungrily. After another drink of water, Tommy asked, And what's the next part of the program? For an answer, Appledore replaced the gag and went out. Tommy was left in darkness. Some time later, he was awakened from a confused sleep by the sound of the door opening. This time, Haydock and Appledore came in together. The gag was removed, and the ropes that held his arms were loosened so that he could sit up and stretch his arms. Haydock had a pistol with him. Tommy, without much inner confidence, began to play his part. He said indignantly, Look here, Haydock, what's the meaning of all this? I've been attacked, kidnapped. The commander was shaking his head. He remarked coldly, Don't waste your breath. You play your role very well. But it's of no importance to me whether you're a member of the British intelligence or merely a clever amateur. How dare you? That's enough, Meadows. I tell you. Haydock thrust his angry face forwards. Be quiet, damn you! Earlier on it would have mattered to find out who you were and who sent you. Now it doesn't. The time's short, you see. And you didn't have the chance to report to anyone what you'd found out. The police will be looking for me as soon as I'm reported missing. Haydock showed his teeth in a sudden smile. I've had the police here. Good men, both friends of mine. They were very concerned about your disappearance, but it's quite clear that you left this house well and alive. They would never dream of looking for you here. You can't keep me here forever, Tommy said. Haydock said, putting on his most British manner, "It won't be necessary, my dear fellow, only until tomorrow night. A boat will arrive at my little cove, and we're sending you on a voyage for your health. Though I don't think you'll be alive, or even on board when it arrives at its destination." "Why didn't you kill me straight away?" "It's such hot weather, my dear fellow. Just occasionally our sea communications are interrupted, and if that were to happen, well, in this heat, if there was a delay, a dead body would soon become very obvious." "I see," said Tommy. He did see. He was to be kept alive until the boat arrived. Then he would be killed, and his dead body taken out to sea. Nothing would ever connect his body, when found, with Smuggler's Rest. "I just came along," continued Haydock, "to ask whether there is anything we could do for you afterwards." Tommy reflected. Then he said, "Thanks, but I won't ask you to take a lock of my hair to my wife or anything of that kind. She'll only miss me when I stop paying the bills, but I dare say she'll soon find a friend elsewhere." He felt he must create the impression that he was operating alone. If no one became suspicious of Tuppence, then the game might still be won. "As you please," said Haydock. "If you did wish to send a message to your friend, we would see that it was delivered." So he was anxious to get a little information. Tommy shook his head. "Nothing. No message." "Very well." Haydock nodded to Appledore. The latter replaced the ropes and the gag. The two men went out, locking the door behind them. Tommy felt anything but cheerful. He faced a rapidly approaching death, with no means of leaving any clue behind him about the information he had discovered. His body was completely helpless. His brain felt completely inactive. There was, of course, still Tuppence, but whoever Tuppence might suspect, it would not be Haydock. 2 witnesses had proved that Tommy had left Smuggler's Rest alive and well. Damn it all, if only he had been more on his guard. If only he could get his mouth free, he could shout for help. Somebody might hear through that tiny window high up in one corner of the room, though it was very unlikely. For the next half hour, he tried to loosen the ropes that they had tied him up with and bite through the gag. It was all hopeless, however. Haydock and Appledore knew their business. It was, he judged, late afternoon. Haydock, he guessed, had gone out. He had heard no sounds from overhead. He was probably playing golf, discussing with his friends at the clubhouse the mystery of what had happened to Meadows. "He dined with me that night and seemed quite normal. Then he just disappeared into the blue." Tommy groaned with fury. That cheerful English manner. It was wonderful what a first-class actor could convince people of. So here he was, a complete failure, tied up like a chicken. What was that? He strained his ears, listening to a far-off sound. Only some man singing a song. And here he was, unable to make a sound to attract anyone's attention. The singing came nearer. A most untuneful noise. but the song was recognizable. It dated from the last war and had been revived for this one. If you were the only girl in the world and I was the only boy. How often he had sung that in 1917, but this fellow simply couldn't sing in tune. Suddenly, Tommy's body grew tense. Surely there was only one person who always went wrong in that particular way. Albert, thought Tommy. Albert prowling round Smuggler's Rest, and here he was, unable to move hand or foot, unable to make a sound. Wait a minute. Was he? There was just one sound, not so easy with the mouth shut as with the mouth open, but it could be done. Desperately, Tommy began to snore. He snored and snored. Short snore, short snore, short snore. Pause. Long snore, long snore, long snore. Pause. Short snore, short snore, short snore. Tommy was snoring the Morse code. Dot, 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 dash, 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 dot, dot, dot. SOS, the international signal that someone needed help. Chapter 12. Although Tuppence went to bed in an optimistic mood, she suffered a severe reaction in those early morning hours when human hope sinks to its lowest. On going down to breakfast, however, her spirits rose with a sight of a letter sitting on her plate, addressed in awkward handwriting. Tuppence opened the letter. Dear Patricia, Auntie Grace is, I am afraid, much worse today. The doctors do not actually say she is dying, but I am afraid that there cannot be much hope. If you want to see her before the end, I think you should come today. If you take the 10:20 train to Yarrow, a friend will meet you with his car. Look forward to seeing you again, dear, in spite of the sad reason. Yours ever, Penelope Plain. It was all Tuppence could do to control her joy. Good old Penny Plain. After breakfast, Tuppence rang up the dressmakers and cancelled a fitting for a coat and skirt for that afternoon. She then went to see Mrs. Perenna and explained that she might be away from home for a night or two. She went up to her room to get ready. Betty Sproat came running out of the Cayleys' bedroom with a mischievous smile on her face. "What have you been doing?" demanded Tuppence. Betty gurgled. "Goosey, goosey, gander." Tuppence chanted, "Whither will you wander? Upstairs?" She lifted Betty high over her head. "Downstairs?" She rolled her on the floor. At this minute, Mrs. Sproat appeared, and Betty was taken off to be dressed for her walk. "Hide," said Betty hopefully. "Hide." "You can't play hide-and-seek now," said Mrs. Sproat. It was 10 o'clock as she left Sans Souci. She had plenty of time. She looked up at the sky, and in doing so stepped into a dark puddle by the gatepost. Without apparently noticing it, she went on. Her heart was dancing. Success! Success! They were going to succeed. Yarrow was a small country station where the village was some distance from the railway. A car was waiting outside the station. A good-looking young man was driving it. He touched 2 fingers to his cap to Tuppence, but the gesture of respect didn't seem to be one he was used to making. Tuppence kicked the front tire. "Isn't this rather flat?" "We haven't got far to go, madam." She nodded and got into the car. They drove not towards the village, but towards the hills. After taking a winding road over a hill, they took a side track that went down sharply into a deep valley. From the shadow of a small group of trees, a man stepped out to meet them. The car stopped, and Tuppence, getting out, went to meet Anthony Marsden. "Beresford's all right," he said quickly. "We located him yesterday. He's a prisoner. The 5th columnists captured him. And for good reasons, he's staying where he is for another 12 hours. You see, there's a small boat due in at a certain place, and we really want to catch it. That's why Beresford's not escaping. We don't want them to realise that we know what they're up to until the last minute." He looked at her anxiously. "You do understand, don't you?" "Oh, yes." Tuppence was staring at a strange mass of material that was half hidden by the trees. "He'll be absolutely all right," continued the young man seriously. "Of course Tommy will be all right," said Tuppence impatiently. "You needn't talk to me as though I was a child of 2. We're both ready to run a few risks. What's that thing over there?" "Well," the young man hesitated. "That's just it. I've been ordered to put a certain proposal before you, but well, frankly, I don't like doing it. You see—" Tuppence gave him a cold look. "Why don't you like doing it?" "Well, you're Deborah's mother, and I mean, what would Deb say to me if— "If I were killed?" inquired Tuppence. "Personally, if I were you, I wouldn't mention it to her. Just tell me about the dangerous and unpleasant job I have to do." "You know," said the young man with enthusiasm, "I think you're splendid. Simply splendid." "Enough compliments," said Tuppence. "I'm admiring myself a good deal, so there's no need for you to join in. What exactly is the big idea?" Tony pointed to the material in the trees. "That," he said, "is a parachute." "Aha," said Tuppence. Her eyes shone. "There was just one parachutist," went on Marsden. "Fortunately, the LDVs around here are an alert group of men. The parachutist was seen, and they captured her." "Her?" "Yes, her. A woman dressed as a hospital nurse. Medium height, middle-aged, with dark hair, and with a slim figure. In fact," said Tuppence, "a woman not unlike me." "Exactly," said Tony. "The next part of it is up to you." Tuppence smiled. She said, "Where do I go, and what do I do?" "I say, Mrs. Beresford, what magnificent courage you've got." "Where do I go, and what do I do?" repeated Tuppence impatiently. "We don't have much information, unfortunately. In the woman's pocket there was a piece of paper with these words on it in German. 'Walk to Leatherbarrow, due east from the Stone Cross, 14 St. Alsulph's Road, Dr. Binion.'" Tuppence looked up. On the hilltop nearby was a stone cross. "That's it," said Tony. "All the signposts have been removed, of course, in case they helped the enemy. But Leatherbarrow's quite a big place, and walking due east from the cross You're sure to find it. How far? 5 miles. Tuppence grinned. Healthy walking exercise, she said. I hope Dr. Binion offers me lunch when I get there. Do you know German, Mrs. Beresford? Just a few tourist phrases. I will have to be firm about speaking English, and say my instructions were to do so. Well, lead me to it. We've got everything here, and a policewoman who's an expert in the art of make-up, explained Tony. Just inside the trees, there was a shed. At the door was a competent-looking middle-aged woman. She looked at Tuppence and nodded approvingly. Inside the shed, seated on an old box, they put on Tuppence's make-up. Finally, the policewoman stood back and remarked, There now, I think we've made a very nice job of it. What do you think, sir? Very good indeed, said Tony. Tuppence stretched out her hand and took the mirror the other woman was holding. She looked at her own face seriously and could hardly hold back a cry of surprise. Her eyebrows had been trimmed to an entirely different shape, which changed her whole expression. Her hair, pulled forward over her ears, hid small pieces of sticking plaster that tightened the skin of her face and altered its shape. Skillful makeup had added several years to her age, with heavy lines running down each side of the mouth. Her whole face now had a rather foolish look to it. It's very clever, said Tuppence admiringly. The other woman produced 2 slices of thin rubber. Do you think you could manage to wear these in your cheeks? Tuppence slipped them in and moved her mouth carefully. It's not really too uncomfortable. Tony then left the shed, and Tuppence took off her own clothing and put on the nurse's uniform. It fitted quite well. The dark blue hat added the final touch to her new personality. She rejected, however, the heavy square-toed shoes. If I've got to walk 5 miles, she said, it's much better if I do it in my own shoes. Both Tony and the policewoman agreed that this was sensible, particularly as Tuppence's own shoes were dark blue ones that went well with the uniform. She looked with interest into the dark blue handbag. Face powder, lipstick, £2.14 and 6pence in English money. A handkerchief and an identity card in the name of Frida Elton, 4 Manchester Road, Sheffield. Tuppence exchanged her own powder and lipstick for the ones in the bag and stood up, prepared to set out. Tony Marsden turned his head away. He said abruptly, I feel very bad about letting you do this. I know just how you feel, but, you see, it's absolutely vital that we should get some idea of just where and how the attack will come. Tuppence patted him on the arm. Don't you worry, my child. Believe it or not, I'm enjoying myself. Rather tired, Tuppence stood outside 14 St. Ulsulph's Road and saw that Dr. Binion was a dental surgeon and not a doctor. From the corner of her eye, she saw Tony Marsden. He was sitting in a fast-looking car outside a house farther down the street. It had been thought necessary for Tuppence to walk to Leatherbarrow exactly as instructed. Tony, with the policewoman, had taken a different route before approaching Leatherbarrow. Everything was now ready. Tuppence crossed the road and rang the bell. The door was opened by an elderly woman. Dr. Binion, said Tuppence. The woman looked her slowly up and down. You will be Nurse Elton, I suppose? Yes. Then you will come up to the doctor's surgery. She stood back, and the door closed behind Tuppence, who found herself standing in a narrow hall. The maid went up the stairs in front of her and opened a door on the first floor. Please wait. The doctor will come to you. She went out, shutting the door behind her. A very ordinary dentist's surgery, somewhat old and worn out. Soon the door would open and Dr. Binion would come in. Who would Dr. Binion be? A stranger? Or someone she had seen before? If it was the person she was half expecting to see... The door opened. The man who entered was not at all the person Tuppence had thought she might see. It was someone she had never considered as being N. It was Commander Haydock. Chapter 13. Would the commander recognize her? Tuppence had so prepared herself before this meeting to show no recognition or surprise, no matter whom she might see. She felt reasonably sure that she had showed no signs of surprise when she recognized Haydock. She rose to her feet and stood there, standing in a respectful attitude. "So, you have arrived," said the commander. He spoke in English, and his manner was exactly the same as usual. "Yes," said Tuppence. "Nurse Elton." Haydock smiled as though at a joke. "Nurse Elton! Excellent!" He looked at her approvingly. "You look absolutely right. And do you know what you have to do? Sit down, please." Tuppence sat down obediently. She replied, "I was told to take detailed instructions from you." "Very proper," said Haydock. There was a faint suggestion of amusement in his voice. "Do you know the day?" "The 4th." Haydock looked surprised. A heavy frown deepened the lines in his forehead. "So you know that, do you?" he muttered. He paused for a minute and then asked, "You have heard, no doubt, of Sans Souci?" "No," said Tuppence firmly. There was a strange smile on the commander's face. "That surprises me very much, since you have been living there for the last month." There was dead silence. The commander said, "What about that, Mrs. Blenkinsop?" "I don't know what you mean, Dr. Binion. I landed by parachute this morning." Again Haydock smiled. Definitely an unpleasant smile. He continued, "A few yards of material pushed into a bush create a wonderful illusion, Mrs. Blenkinsop. Or perhaps you would prefer me to address you by your real name of Beresford." Again there was a silence. Tuppence took a deep breath. Haydock nodded. "You've lost the game." There was a faint click, and the blue steel of a pistol showed in his hand. His voice took on a grim note as he added, "And I should advise you not to make any noise. You'd be dead before you made so much as a single cry. And even if you did manage to scream, it wouldn't get you any attention. Patients who are under anesthetic often cry out, you know." Tuppence said quietly, "You seem to have thought of everything. Has it occurred to you that I have friends who know where I am?" "Ah, you are thinking of young Marsden. I'm sorry, Mrs. Beresford, but Anthony happens to be one of our most enthusiastic supporters in this country.
As I said just now, a few yards of material creates a wonderful effect. You believed the parachute idea quite easily.
I don't see the point of all this acting.
Don't you? We don't want your friends to find you too easily. If they pick up your trail, it will lead to Yarrow and to a man in a car. The fact that a hospital nurse of quite different appearance walked into Leatherbarrow between 1 and 2 o'clock will hardly be connected with your disappearance.
Very clever, said Tuppence. Haydock said,
I admire your courage, you know. I admire it very much. I'm sorry to have to force you, but it's vital that we should know just exactly how much you discovered at Sans Souci.
Tuppence did not answer. Haydock said quietly,
I'd advise you to tell me everything. There are certain possibilities in a dentist's chair, and these instruments can cause a lot of damage.
Tuppence gave him an arrogant look.
Yes, Haydock observed slowly, I imagine you've got a lot of courage. But what about the other half of the picture?
What do you mean?
I'm talking about Thomas Beresford, your husband, who has lately been living at Sans Souci under the name of Mr. Meadows, and who is now, very conveniently, tied up in the cellar of my house.
Tuppence declared, I don't believe it.
Because of the Penny Plain letter? Don't you realize that that was just a clever bit of work on the part of young Anthony? You fell into his trap nicely when you gave him the code.
Tuppence's voice trembled. Then Tommy...
Tommy, said Commander Haydock, is where he has been all along, completely in my power. It's up to you now. If you answer my questions satisfactorily, there's a chance for him. If you don't, well, he'll be knocked on the head, taken out to sea and thrown overboard.
Tuppence was silent for a minute or two. Then she asked, What do you want to know?
I want to know who employed you, what your means of communication with that person or persons are, what you have reported so far, and exactly what you know.
Tuppence shrugged her shoulders. I could tell you what lies I choose, she pointed out.
No, because I will proceed to test what you say.
He drew his chair a little nearer.
My dear woman, I know just what you feel about it all, but believe me when I say I really do admire both you and your husband immensely. You've got strength and bravery. It's people like you that will be needed in the new state. The state that will arise in this country when your present weak government is destroyed. We want to turn some of our enemies into friends, those that are worthwhile. If I have to give the order that ends your husband's life, I will do it. It's my duty. But I will feel really bad about having to do so. He's a fine fellow. Let me explain what so few people in this country seem to understand. Our leader does not intend to conquer this country. He intends to create a new Britain, a Britain strong in its own power, ruled not by Germans, but by Englishmen. And the best type of Englishmen. Englishmen with brains and education and courage. A brave new world, as Shakespeare puts it. We want no more confusion and inefficiency. And in this new state, we want people like you and your husband, brave and intelligent enemies, to be our friends. You would be surprised if you knew how many there are in this country, as there are in other countries, who have sympathy with us and believe in our aims. Between us all, we will create a new Europe, a Europe of peace and progress. Try and see it that way, because I assure you, it is that way.
His voice was mesmerizing, and he looked the perfect picture of an honest British sailor. Tuppence stared at him and searched her mind for an appropriate phrase. She was only able to find one that was both childish and rude. "Goosey, goosey, gander," said Tuppence, reciting the nursery rhyme she had last repeated while playing with Betty. The effect on Haydock was so intense that she was quite amazed. He jumped to his feet. His face went dark purple with anger, and in a second all resemblance to a cheerful British sailor had vanished. She saw what Tommy had once seen, an angry Prussian officer. He swore at her fluently in German. Then, changing to English, he shouted, "You dangerous little fool! Don't you realize you give yourself away completely answering like that? You can't be allowed to live now, you and your precious husband!" Raising his voice, he called, "Anna!" The woman came into the room. Haydock pushed the pistol into her hand. "Watch her! Shoot if necessary!" He went out of the room. Tuppence looked at Anna, who stood in front of her with an expressionless face. "Would you really shoot me?" Anna answered quietly. "In the last war my son was killed, my Otto. I was 38 then. I am 62 now, but I have not forgotten." Tuppence looked at the broad face. It reminded her of the Polish woman, Wanda Polonska. She had that same frightening determination. Something came to Tuppence's brain, some vague memory, something that she had always tried to remember, something that she had known but had never succeeded in bringing into focus in her mind. The door opened. Commander Haydock came back into the room. He shouted out, still very angry, "Where is it? Where have you hidden it?" Tuppence stared at him. What he was saying did not make sense to her. She had taken nothing and hidden nothing. Haydock said to Anna, "Get out!" The woman handed the pistol to him and left the room at once. Haydock threw himself into a chair and seemed to be trying hard to control himself. He said, "You can't escape, you know. I've got you, and I've got ways of making people speak, not pretty ways. You'll have to tell the truth in the end. Now then, what have you done with it?" Tuppence was quick to see that here, at least, was something that gave her the possibility of bargaining. If only she could work out what it was she was supposed to have in her possession. She said cautiously, "How do you know I've got it?" "From what you said, you silly little fool. You haven't got it on you, that we know, since you changed completely into this nurse's uniform." "Suppose I posted it to someone," said Tuppence. "Don't be an idiot. Everything you posted since yesterday has been examined. You didn't post it. No. There's only one thing you could have done. Hidden it in Sans Souci before you left this morning.
I give you just 3 minutes to tell me where that hiding place is. He put his watch down on the table. 3 minutes, Mrs. Thomas Beresford. The clock above the fireplace ticked. Tuppence sat quite still, with a blank, expressionless face. It didn't show the thoughts racing behind it. In a flash of understanding, she saw everything, and realized at last who was the center of the whole organization. It came as quite a shock to her when Haydock said, 10 seconds more. As if in a dream, she watched him, saw the arm holding the pistol rise, heard him count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He had reached 8 when the shot rang out, and he collapsed forward on his chair, a puzzled expression on his broad red face. He had been so focused on watching his victim that he had been unaware of the door behind him opening. In a flash, Tuppence was on her feet. She pushed her way past the uniformed men in the doorway and took hold urgently of an arm belonging to someone she knew. "Mr. Grant!" Yes, my dear. It's all right now. You've been wonderful." Tuppence ignored these reassurances. "Quick! There's no time to lose. You've got a car here?" "Yes." He stared at her. "A fast one?" "We must get to Sans-Souci at once. If only we're in time, before they telephone here and get no answer." 2 minutes later, they were in the car, and it was making its way through the streets of Leatherbarrow. Then they were out in the open country, moving fast. Mr. Grant asked no questions. He was content to sit quietly whilst Tuppence watched the speedometer in an agony of fear. The driver had been given his orders, and he drove with all the speed the car was capable of. Tuppence only spoke once. "Tommy?" "He's quite all right. He was rescued half an hour ago." She nodded. Now at last they were nearing Leahampton. The car raced and twisted through the town, then up the hill. Tuppence jumped out, and she and Mr. Grant ran up the drive. The hall door, as usual, was open. There was no one in sight. Tuppence ran lightly up the stairs. She glanced inside her own room as she passed it, and noted the open drawers and untidy bed. She nodded to herself and passed on along the upper hall and into the room occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Cayley. The room was empty. It looked peaceful and smelt slightly of medicines. Tuppence ran across to the bed and pulled at the coverings. They fell to the ground, and Tuppence put her hand under the mattress. She turned triumphantly to Mr. Grant with a well-worn child's picture book in her hand. "Here you are. It's all in here." "What on earth?" They turned. Mrs. Sproat was standing in the doorway staring at them. "And now," said Tuppence, "let me introduce you to M. Yes, Mrs. Sproat. I should have known all along." It was left to Mrs. Cayley, arriving in the doorway a moment later, to introduce the appropriate anticlimax. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Cayley, looking with dismay at her husband's bed. "Whatever will Mr. Cayley say?" Chapter 14. "I should have known all along," exclaimed Tuppence. She was calming her nerves with a large glass of brandy, and was smiling broadly at Tommy and Mr. Grant and Albert, who was sitting with a pint of beer and grinning from ear to ear.
Tell us about it, Tuppence, urged Tommy. You first, said Tuppence. There's not much for me to tell, said Tommy. A complete accident in Haydock's bathroom led me to the secret wireless transmitter. I tried to pretend I thought it must have belonged to Hahn, the previous owner of Smugglers, but Haydock was too clever for me. Tuppence nodded and said, He telephoned Mrs. Sproat at once, and she ran out into the drive and waited for you. After that, said Tommy, the credit belongs entirely to Albert. He was investigating around Haydock's place because it was the last place I'd been. I did some intense Morse code snoring, and he understood it immediately. He went off to Mr. Grant with the news, and the two of them came back late that night. I did some more snoring. The result was that I agreed to remain in the cellar so that we could catch the people in the boat when it arrived. Mr. Grant added his part of the story. When Haydock went off this morning, our people took charge at Smuggler's Rest. We captured the boat this evening. And now, Tuppence, said Tommy, your story. Well, to begin with, I was the biggest fool all along. I suspected everybody here except Mrs. Sproat. Then Tommy disappeared. I was just getting a plan together with Albert when suddenly Anthony Marsden arrived. He seemed all right to begin with. He was the usual sort of young man that Deborah often has around. But two things made me think a bit. First, I became more and more convinced as I talked to him that I had never seen him before, and that he had never been to the flat. The second thing was that, though he seemed to know all about my working at Leahampton, he assumed that Tommy was in Scotland. Now, that seemed all wrong. If he knew about anyone, it would be Tommy, since I wasn't here officially. That seemed very strange to me. Mr. Grant had told me that fifth columnists were everywhere. So why shouldn't one of them be working in Deborah's department? I was suspicious enough to lay a trap for him. I told him that Tommy and I had fixed up a code for communicating with each other. I told Anthony we used the saying penny plain, tuppence coloured in letters, and said we spelt plain as P-L-A-Y-N-E. As I hoped, he believed it completely. I got a letter this morning which gave him away totally. I'd worked out all the arrangements with Albert beforehand. All I had to do was to pretend to be ringing up a dressmaker to cancel a fitting, but really I was phoning Albert to let him know that Anthony was a traitor, and that N or M, or both of them, wanted to know more about me and what I knew. It gave me a shock, said Albert. I drove up with a baker's van, and we poured a pool of aniseed just outside the gate. And then, Tuppence took up the story, I came out and walked in the aniseed. Of course it was easy for the baker's van to follow me to the station, and then someone else, who was also following me, came up behind me and heard me book a ticket to Yarrow. It was after that it might have been difficult. The dogs we'd brought followed the smell of the aniseed well, said Mr. Grant. They picked it up at Yarrow Station, and again on the track the tyre had made, after you kicked your shoe on it. It led us down to the trees and up again to the stone cross, and where you had walked over the hills. The enemy had no idea we could follow you easily,
after they had seen you set off walking and had driven off themselves. All the same, said Albert, it made me very worried, knowing you were in that house and not knowing what might be happening to you there. We got in a back window and caught the foreign woman as she came down the stairs. We came in just in time to save you. I knew you'd come, said Tuppence. The thing was for me to keep things going as long as I could. What was really exciting was the way I suddenly saw the whole thing, and what a fool I'd been. How did you see it? Asked Tommy. Goosey, goosey, gander, said Tuppence promptly. When I said that to Commander Haydock, he went absolutely mad. And not just because it was silly and rude. No. I saw at once that it meant something to him. And then there was the expression on that German woman's face. Anna, it was like the Polish woman's. And then, of course, I thought of King Solomon, who ruled Israel thousands of years ago, and I saw the whole thing. Tommy gave a sigh of exasperation. Tuppence, if you say that once again, I'll shoot you myself. Saw or what? And what on earth has Solomon got to do with it? Do you remember that 2 women came to Solomon with a baby, and both said it was hers, but Solomon said, very well, cut it in 2, and the false mother said, all right, but the real mother said, no, let the other woman have it. You see, the real mother couldn't face her child being killed. Well, the night that Mrs. Sproat shot the other woman, you all said what a miracle it was, and how easily she might have shot the child. Of course, it ought to have been quite clear then. If it had been her child, she wouldn't have risked that shot for a minute. It proved that Betty wasn't her child, and that's why she absolutely had to shoot the other woman. Why? Because, of course, the other woman was the child's real mother. Tuppence's voice shook a little. Poor thing. Poor hunted thing. She came over to England as a refugee, with nothing, and so she was grateful when Mrs. Sproat asked if she could adopt her baby and gave her money. But why did Mrs. Sproat want to adopt the child? Camouflage! It would be hard to believe that a master spy would involve her child in the business. That's the main reason why I never considered Mrs. Sproat seriously, simply because of the child. But Betty's real mother had a terrible longing for her baby, and she found out where Mrs. Sproat was living and came down here. She waited around for her chance, and at last she got it and went off with the child. Mrs. Sproat, of course, was terribly worried. At all costs, she didn't want the police to get involved. So she wrote that message and pretended she'd found it in her bedroom. And she made sure Commander Haydock was brought in to help. Then, when we'd tracked down the poor woman, Mrs. Sproat couldn't risk being discovered, so she shot her. She pretended not to know anything about firearms, when, in fact, she was a very fine shot. Yes, she killed that poor woman, and because of that, I've no pity for her. She was bad through and through. Tuppence paused. Then she went on. Another thing that ought to have given me a hint was the likeness between Wanda Polonska and Betty. It was Betty the woman reminded me of all along,
and then the child's strange play with my shoelaces. How much more likely that she'd seen her mother do that, not Carl von Dynam. But as soon as Mrs. Sproat saw what the child was doing, she placed a lot of evidence for us to find in Carl's room, and added the master touch of a shoelace soaked in secret ink.
"I'm glad that Carl wasn't involved," said Tommy. "I liked him."
"He's not been shot, has he?" asked Tuppence anxiously, noting the past tense. Mr. Grant shook his head.
"He's all right," he grinned. "As a matter of fact, I've got a little surprise for you there."
Tuppence's face lit up as she said, "I'm terribly glad, for Sheila's sake. Of course we were idiots to suspect Mrs. Perenna."
"She was mixed up in some IRA activities, nothing more," said Mr. Grant.
"I suspected Mrs. O'Rourke a little, and sometimes the Cayleys."
"And I suspected Bletchley," put in Tommy.
"And all the time," said Tuppence, "it was that silly creature we just thought of as Betty's mother."
"Not exactly silly," said Mr. Grant. "A very dangerous woman and a very clever actress, and, I'm sorry to say, English by birth."
Tuppence said, "Then I've no pity or admiration for her. It wasn't even her own country she was working for." She looked at Mr. Grant. "Did you find what you wanted?" Mr. Grant nodded.
"It was all in that old collection of children's books."
"The ones that Betty said were nasty?" Tuppence exclaimed.
"They were nasty," said Mr. Grant dryly. "Little Jack Horner contained very full details of our naval operations. Johnny Head in Air did the same for the Air Force. Details of the Army were appropriately hidden in There Was a Little Man and He Had a Little Gun."
"And Goosey Goosey Gander?" asked Tuppence.
Mr. Grant said, "That book contains, written in invisible ink, a full list of all the important people who have agreed to assist in an invasion of this country. Among them were 2 chief constables, an air vice-marshal, 2 generals, the head of an armaments works, a cabinet minister, many police superintendents, commanders of local volunteer defense organizations, and various military and naval junior officers, as well as members of our own intelligence force."
Tommy and Tuppence stared at him.
"Incredible," said Tommy.
Grant shook his head.
"You don't understand the force of the German propaganda. It appeals to something in a man, some desire for power. These people were ready to betray their country not for money, but in a kind of superior pride in what they themselves were going to achieve for that country. In every other country it has been the same. And you can see that with such people able to issue contradictory orders and confuse operations, the invasion would have had every chance of succeeding."
"And now?" said Tuppence. Mr. Grant smiled.
"And now," he said, "let them come. We'll be ready for them."
Chapter 15. "Darling," said Deborah, as they sat at a table in the ballroom of the Ritz Hotel in London, "do you know I almost thought the most terrible things about you?"
"Did you?"
said Tuppence.
"When?"
Her eyes rested lovingly on her daughter's dark head. "That time when you went off to Scotland to join Father, and I thought you were with Aunt Gracie. I almost thought you were having an affair with someone."
"Oh, Deb, did you?"
"Not really, of course. Not at your age. And of course I knew you and Father are devoted to each other. It was really an idiot called Tony Marsden who put it into my head. Do you know, Mother, they discovered he was a fifth columnist."
"Did you like him at all?"
"Tony? Oh no, he was always so boring. Oh, I must dance to this tune. I love it."
She floated away in the arms of a fair-haired young man, smiling up at him sweetly. Tuppence followed their movements for a few minutes. Then her eyes looked over to where a tall young man in Air Force uniform was dancing with a slim, fair-haired girl.
"I do think, Tommy," said Tuppence, "that our children are rather nice."
"Here's Sheila," said Tommy.
He got up as Sheila Perenna came towards their table. She was dressed in a bright green evening dress which showed up her dark beauty. It was an unhappy beauty tonight, and she greeted her host and hostess rather ungraciously. "I've come, you see," she said, "as I promised, but I can't think why you wanted to